Before watching the video, be warned that this is a science fiction story, but it's still a story about a cheating wife and payback. I've posted stories like this a few times before, and many of you really enjoyed them and wanted a sequel. So here it is. Enjoy. Trinity is right in the middle of Jornada del Muerto. And yes, that means Dead Man's Journey. You drive past it on a 2-lane road that runs right through the White Sands Missile Range, deep in the sonorous New Mexico desert. It was night, and the road was empty. The sky was black velvet, and the stars were as clear as they come where there is no civilization. There was even the occasional meteor that flew across the horizon, looking like a lone snowflake. It was just me, my trusty F-150, and the occasional armadillo. All that was missing was a smelly old brown dog named Buster, and it would have been a sad country-style song. I remembered a few days ago. Funny how a simple decision can change your life. To cross the street or not to cross the street, to turn left or right, to scratch an itch or not to scratch an itch. We make hundreds of these choices every day, and sometimes they can kill you. I couldn't figure anything out. She just acted differently. There was too much detail in her work, like she was painting a picture. She was too attentive to the schedule, as if she was watching me and meticulously fulfilling her feminine duties. In this age, it's too easy to get to the truth. In fact, people would be less deceitful if they knew how far technology extends. So when that little devil's suspicion tickled my fancy, I simply downloaded the highly rated bluejacking tool. The only problem is that you might find out things you just don't want to find out. Brenda was a great wife, smart, witty, gorgeous, and just a monster in the bedroom. How we met and married is irrelevant. Suffice it to say that for 14 years, we lived happy middle-class lives in the northeast suburbs of Albuquerque. We were unemployed by choice, so we could afford the best of everything: a nice house, frequent travel, and expensive restaurants. My wife did PR consulting for an international firm that had made its fortune paving the paradise. Given New Mexico's sunny climate, building trails had long been a growth industry. The only problem was that people living in paradise might not want to pave it. So Brenda held many meetings and networked with major financiers and politicians. Brenda's career was my version of Dante's 90th level of hell. I'm a nerd, you see, and nerds don't get out much. I do botany at Sandia National Laboratories, which is why we lived in Albuquerque. It's a high-paying, low-stress job because I'm very good at what I do. I work in counterintelligence technology. It's a profession that is all about lying and deception, kind of like politics. The job involves a lot of old-fashioned machismo, but it's more like Dr. Evil's machismo than Conan's machismo. Of course, the devilishly clever will always win out over the muscular and stupid. You're probably wondering how Brenda and I ended up in the beauty and the geek role. Like I said, the details of the affair are irrelevant. We hit it off because we are both smart, fun, and adventurous. She's dated a lot of jocks and pretty boys. I'm not bad-looking and reasonably well off, so I've had my share of hot women. The problem was that everyone we dated before we met bored us to tears. Once you get married, you are only going to spend a significant amount of time with one person. Therefore, you better marry someone who excites you. Brenda and I had very different personalities, but we fit together like we were made for each other. But that doesn't mean we walked around joined at the hip. We had our own interests and special abilities, but our complementary qualities cemented our bond. Brenda's emotions made her an exciting partner. There was never a dull or dreary moment with my wife. But sometimes her feelings took over and she relied on me to calm her down. And me? I'm too brainy. Brenda pulled me out of my own thoughts. We're both not very big. Brenda is 5'2" and I could be called 5'9". But we are both as healthy as can be. We both love the outdoors, and Albuquerque is the perfect place for that. We hiked, biked, and kayaked daily. People thought we were the perfect couple. I think it was my lack of height that gave Hondo the idea that Brenda would be easy prey. The neighbor was Richard Tadwell. He was a major in one of the training wings at Kirtland, and the role of the great American hero was right up his alley. He had even adopted a call sign. No one knew where he got it, for he wasn't a pilot. But he preferred to be called Hondo. Most of us just called him Tud, mostly because he hated being called that. Tud was muscular, half a foot taller than me and maybe 70 pounds heavier. Most of that weight was subcutaneous fat, whereas I didn't have an ounce of fat at 75. But the contrast in size made it seem like I was 3/4 taller than he was. And he didn't hide it. Every guy has been bullied. Most either take it or fight it. But there are some fun alternatives. I've always had a way with words. So in bullying situations, I always responded with a clever remark that got to everyone else, but flew right over the target's head. The trick was to hit the guy in such a way that he wouldn't realize it had happened until he turned around and his head fell off. So when Hondo patronizingly called me Little Davy, I would shrug, laugh self-consciously, and guffaw. Not where it counts, little Dicky. The look of confusion in Tud's, eyes at the rolling laughter was priceless. The snake snuck into my garden because people in our neighborhood like to have fun. There are many things that interest me, but none of them include gossip, innuendo, or frank judgments about the worldly adventures of distant acquaintances. But Brenda is steeped in it. I could never tell if her group really enjoyed each other's company or if the parties were just a playing field on which they could stake out territory. What I do know is that there was too much drinking and up-close and personal contact between the various players. I went to these horrible events because that's what good husbands do. However, because I cared the least about golf or the Albuquerque Isotopes win-loss record, I was always categorized as an auxiliary spouse, while the insiders reveled in the pleasures of the herd. The typical pattern was a cheerful arrival, followed by a machine gun crackle of small talk as they recounted the events of 6 long days apart. Then, after the wheels of the overall mechanism had been greased with copious amounts of alcohol, the participants would get down to the real point of the evening: cozy, drunken conversations. These conversations usually involved overly familiar touches, some questionable touches, and a melodramatic outpouring of emotion on topics that would seem trivial if both participants were of sound mind. Brenda lived for that sort of thing. She told me she was a people person. Undoubtedly she was. But she also enjoyed playing mother confessor to her daredevil girlfriends. Vampires need to suck blood, and Brenda seemed to have the same need to gossip. Nevertheless, I learned some very shocking things about the supposedly happily married residents of the neighborhood. It was at one such party that I discovered my wife in intimate conversation with Hondo Tadwell. It was amazing. Tud was hunched over and looking distraught, and Brenda was lovingly squeezing his hand in hers. I would have believed the pretense if it weren't for the fact that Hondo kept his eyes on Brenda's adorable cleavage while he poured out his heart. I hated the guy for a number of reasons, besides the fake machista act. The scene playing out in front of me only added another count to the indictment. Turd was a tireless womanizer. He told anyone who was foolish enough to ask that it was his privilege as the alpha male in the herd. We all thought it was because he was an amoral asshole. We usually didn't pay attention to him unless he was hitting on your wife. Then the impulse was to snatch her from his clutches, and the sooner the better. So I said nonchalantly, though I was seething inside, "Come on, Brenda, it's getting late." She looked up, anger flashing across her face, and she said, "Can't you see we're discussing something important, Davy?" Now that was a different reaction. Turd realized he was caught. So he began to grieve nobly. He said, "No, Brenda, you've been a great help to me. You need to go home with your husband." Then he patted her hand sadly, got up and wandered back into the seething mass of people, dragging the broken and defeated behind him. St. Brenda was distraught all the way home. It seems Turd's wife, the woman he had loved since they graduated from Texas A&M University of the Arts, had begun to cheat on him, and he was devastated. They were the perfect couple. Turd was an obnoxious, narcissistic asshole, and Polly was an empty-headed, narcissistic bimbo who had once been Miss Texas World. Turd prodded Brenda in a dark corner to ask her advice. When I stumbled into their cozy sit-down, Brenda was helping Dickhead deal with grief. I didn't believe it for a minute. But Brenda loves heartwarming melodrama, and she was unhappy that I'd broken up her little tete-a-tete. According to St. Brenda, Turd has uncovered dirt on Polly, and it's killing him. Any sane person would have immediately said that was bullshit. Turd was as elusive as Pepe Le Pew in his relentless pursuit of everything in a dress. So he had many of his own excursions off the reservation. But Brenda bought Turd's story. In the ensuing argument, Brenda tried to justify her willingness to listen to this smug goofball by telling me that he was actually very sensitive underneath all the glitz. Of course, this remark opened up another front. I said hotly, "And how do you know anything about what may or may not be lurking beneath Tadwell's teenage exterior? Have you ever spent any time in his treehouse?" Brenda had the nobility to look embarrassed. She replied, "Well, he stopped by a couple times to talk to you. But you were never there when he did. That hit me right between the eyes." It didn't seem like Turd was even trying to be subtle. I said, "Did it ever occur to you that you might be his target?" Brenda was genuinely puzzled. She said, "Why would he talk to me? You're the one with the big government powers. He said he needed to discuss something about clearances. Now that's someone who doesn't get it. I said, "Look, Brenda, you're the most beautiful woman on the block." "Every guy on the block thinks so." Brenda looked at me with the typical feminine look that said she liked to hear that. But she didn't like hearing it from me because it created fertile ground for jealousy. I continued. "The camel was just trying to find out how far under the tent he could stick his fat lips." "I hope you didn't invite him in." She looked concerned. She said, "I invited him in a few times. He asked if he could come in and wait for you." "But he didn't linger." I asked, sounding even more disgruntled. "How many is a few? And why wasn't he there when I came in?" Brenda looked as if something was beginning to get through to her. She replied, "Well, for the last month it's been 3 or 4 times a week in the afternoon. He stops by on his way home from Kirtland, but you were always at work. He waits for a while and we talk, but he has to go home or Polly will worry." I laughed out loud and said, "That's the biggest nonsense I've ever heard. Since when does Tudwell give a damn what his wife thinks?" Brenda looked at me indignantly and said, "He treasures his marriage very much. He tells me over and over how lucky we are to have each other. He wishes he had what we have. That's why I was so supportive when he told me about Polly's infidelity." I replied angrily, "He wants some of what I have, and he'd better keep it just a wish. Henceforth tell Hondo to call me if he needs to talk." "I don't want to catch him alone with you," Brenda said, getting very angry. "You don't get to tell me what to do. This isn't the Dark Ages." The discussion was going down a dark and dangerous road. So I said, "For the sake of compromise, if he shows up again, just call me at work. I guarantee I'll be there in less than 10 minutes. I knew that would chase the varmint away. Needless to say, we didn't have sex that night and for weeks afterward. However, we did love each other, and the ice eventually melted. By the end of the month, we had both completely forgotten about it. I thought, Santa Fe is 1.5 miles above sea level. So even though it's hot in Albuquerque, it's always nice there. Also, Santa Fe has the most interesting art scene in the U.S. Brenda and I were fans of Georgia O'Keeffe, and her museum was selling several originals. The paintings went for between $1 million and $5 million. But I had my eye on a signed serograph. It seemed like we could get it for only $3,000. So we went there to try our luck. Sometimes we camp out. But this was an expedition for fine art. So we took a different route and stayed at the Inn of the Five Graces, which is relatively close to the museum. The place has a hacienda atmosphere, with faux adobe walls and heavy Spanish furniture. The bed looked as if Ferdinand and Isabella had carved it in the monstrosity's Roos workshop. The word ornate didn't fit to describe it. This was very apropos, as Brenda was finally back in good spirits. All month my wife had been distant. I attributed it to a fight over turd. She thought I was being mean and insensitive, whereas I thought she was being an idiot. We actually made love more often than usual. But it wasn't the usual all-in-one extravaganza we were both used to. Obviously, the tender feelings were still there. Evening came as we finished our meal at a nearby restaurant. There is something special about a sunset on a warm evening in Santa Fe. The air is soft and the light has a unique red-golden hue. The sky was almost purple with bright incipient stars, and the crescent moon rising in the northeast made me want to howl. And Brenda's enthusiastic look told me that howling would have to do tonight. The next day we went to the museum. Some men view their wives as trophies, living proof of their masculinity. I never saw Brenda that way. She was my age and my partner. Her beauty was only one aspect of her contribution to our relationship. It was her spunky spirit and loving, warm heart that made her who she was. But now I was caught in a Chinese finger trap. The more I lashed out at my wife about Turd making a big deal out of it, the more she chided me for being mean and jealous. At the same time, I couldn't take Turd aside and tell him to stop making a cock of himself. I'd look like a paranoid wuss. I refrained from making any moves, hoping she'd either come to her senses or Turd would screw up by taking things too far. I'm serious, you have to trust your wife. She's the only person in this cruel world you can rely on. And it's a very slippery slope if you start to have doubts. Maybe I'm being too cynical. But it seemed to me that Brenda's inherent faith in humanity was her Achilles' heel. It made her a logical prey for any man cruel enough to take advantage of her innate tenderness. Of course, you'd have to be an immoral jerk to do that. But I knew someone who fit that description. Shakespeare was the first to write, "All the world's a stage, and one man plays many parts in his time." In short, what you believe to be reality is written and directed by you in your own head. Turd could have been a buffoon in his role as Captain America, the alpha dog in the pack, But alas, he didn't know that. In fact, he thought he was entitled to every right and privilege, and that's exactly how he behaved. The reality of his aggressive attempts to play Brenda off made him a threat because she couldn't see it. So I had to do something about it. I guess there are some people who get away with cheating. But most couples get caught because cheating is such a complicated process. If you're cheating, you have to keep an eye on all the normal stuff, as well as a bunch of abnormal stuff. And normal people just aren't able to cover all the bases. That's why people who do things they shouldn't do will inevitably be exposed. Unexplained behavior always has a logical explanation. This truth applies to any aspect of life. For example, this is how scientists discovered the planet Neptune. They noticed that the orbit of Uranus was deviating from the norm, made calculations, and discovered that Neptune was pulling behind it. This is why the phenomenon of covert influence is called the planetary body principle. The same concept applies to fraud. There is always some malevolent body behind a change in normal behavior. Watching Turd and Brenda socialize at parties, I could see him trying to pull her into his orbit. So I made the decision to cross the Rubicon. I used the 6 days before the next party to visit a darknet market and buy a simple man-in-the-middle package. I did it harmlessly. After all, if you start buying military-grade hacking tools from the deep web marketplace, you quickly become a person of great interest to agencies, both foreign and domestic. I dropped the bomb at the next barbecue. I sat with the rest of the geeks while Turd hung around looking like someone had shot his dog. Brenda watched him carefully as I asked her not to. I scanned Turd's cell phone. Naturally, he was wide open. He never bothered with silly things like protecting his phone from the likes of me. Of course, the only reliable way he could protect it from me would be to run it over with his car. But I digress. It took less than a minute to plant my pet peeve on Turd's cell phone. He immediately sent Brenda a picture of the adorable kitten. The flying monkey was hidden in the steganography. She opened the picture and gave Turd an admiring look. Everything else was done by the rootkit she'd launched while doing so. Turd looked confused, which was to be expected, since they both had no idea how much stealth crap I had just added to the background processes running on both of their devices. From now on, everything they did, photos, calls, and texts, would be under my control and recorded in the cloud account I owned. I looked at my wife, who was comforting Tadwell. I said under my breath, "Brenda, I barely knew you." It was a paradox of paradoxes. I wanted to know. I needed to know. But I didn't want to find out. Healthy people don't dwell on life-destroying events like this. It proved that I wasn't as cool and self-sufficient as I pretended to be. The world is a cruel place, and a good marriage helps you deal with all that crap. It gives you a companion and a friend, no matter the threat or circumstance. So I really wanted to write off my suspicions as simple paranoia. I could live with a low opinion of myself. But what I could not bear was a discovery that would cost me an orderly and happy life. A figurative symbol of two people's fidelity is their willingness to limit their intimacy to each other. I mean, seriously, you can't share your private self with more than one person and maintain a special bond. And you can't trust someone who thinks they can. The problem is that humans are not naturally monogamous. So it takes a conscious act of will to remain faithful. A strong and moral person will keep their promises. People without honor will not. So in many ways, fidelity is a litmus test of a person's character. I had known Brenda for a long time and understood how important personal integrity was to her. So I couldn't imagine a circumstance in which she would willingly sacrifice her precious self-esteem, especially for the sake of scratching an itch. Theoretically, of course. But if you're secretly trying to learn something, you shouldn't be surprised when you learn something new. But I was amazed. The fateful call came at 9:23 a.m. on the Monday morning after the party. It was Dickhead. Humble gratitude oozed from every pore. "Brenda, you're the only person who understands what I'm going through. I would have killed myself if it weren't for your love. It's so hard for me to stay away from you, knowing what we've shared." My heart dropped. Brenda said with desperation in her voice, "I've already told you, Richard, that I don't love you. I love my husband. I'm only doing this to help you adjust to your new life without Polly." What to do? My brain went into DEFCON 1 mode. "Gun drawn," Turd said with regret in his voice. "I know that. But it's the only thing keeping me afloat. We may meet in the near future. I really need your special comfort," Brenda said, her voice softening. "I understand. I'd feel the same way if I found out Davy was screwing around with her. We can meet one last time. But you're going to have to go through this without my help. I don't want to lose my marriage because you can't handle it. Seriously, Was this woman completely delusional? The rest of the conversation passed in preparations. Tudwell was going to come to Holloman on some Air Force business and wanted Brenda to meet him in Alamogordo the following Wednesday. That was over 200 miles away. So it must have been a safe distance to meet, Brenda pondered. But Turd's pathetic whining eventually overcame her resistance. Brenda's company owns a fleet of small two-seat helicopters. They use them to circle their service area. To get in the game of real estate development in New Mexico, you almost had to do it, since the desert areas aren't that close together. So Brenda had a private helicopter pilot's license and was used to flying to different locations. It was one of her most interesting quirks. She could easily fly to Alamogordo and back in one workday. You might think my wife is either a complete idiot or a whore. No one with an IQ above room temperature would fall for Turd's bullshit. But this man has been at her for God knows how long to intimidate her. And by the looks of it, he's succeeded. Brenda was innately kind, warm-hearted, and sentimental. She loved puppies and kittens and cried at every heartwarming movie. Unfortunately, she was also willing to fool herself into believing that people meant exactly what they said. The call ended with Brenda saying, "I'll meet you at the usual place." "But this is the last time," Turd said with tears in his voice. "Yes, I know, and thank you." My initial reaction was a confused, vacant-eyed, "Oh, shit." Look, the kind Wile E. Coyote always gets when he discovers he's run off a cliff. And just like the coyote, it was immediately followed by a long fall that smears your guts all over the desert landscape. How could Brenda have been so stupid? Stroke, heart attack, take your pick. You're walking down the street not caring about anything, and then your life changes. All your former certainties evaporate and are replaced by a terrible and all-consuming feeling of desolation and hopelessness. That's how it is with me. The first explosion of anger was directed at myself. I had underestimated Turd. He was such a caricature of a human being. I assumed everyone could see right through him. But of course I wasn't there for him during the long hours he spent at our kitchen table painting his wife a different picture. Turd must have convinced Brenda that he was sensitive and sincere. Underneath all that nonsense lurked a genuinely nice man. In fact, he might have used what Brenda knew about his asshole personality as a form of mental jujitsu to convince her that his obnoxious behavior was meant to protect his gentle self from the hardships of a cold, cruel world. For Brenda, this would be a godsend. Since Turd's social development hadn't progressed beyond the age of 14, it probably hadn't occurred to him that there might be consequences. I'm not a physical type, but I do have a certain skill set. And I was planning on shitting on Richard Tadwell from a very great height. It was Monday. I had business at Sandia. But the rage burning in my heart demanded satisfaction. I didn't know the whole story yet. What's more, I wasn't even sure anything had happened at all. My little pet hadn't unearthed any new information since Monday morning. Nevertheless, I was preparing for the worst. I was going to stay in Alamogordo for the last act because I had to officially finalize things with Brenda. Then I could agonize in peace. Of course, my decision to wrap things up on Wednesday meant that I would have to endure 2 nights with a woman who was doing her best to appear to adore me. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. It simply means that people combine contradictory facts into a convenient truth. In essence, a person splits themselves into 2 conflicting identities. Tonight I dealt with the real Brenda, the faithful and loyal one. The short-lived version of cheating only appeared when I wasn't around. I tried to discern a single sign that my wife was thinking about betraying me. All I saw was love and loyalty. Her eyes shone with devotion when we ate at La Crêpe Michel, a small place we favored because of the vegetarian dishes. She really believed her lies. It made me wonder if she had lost her mind. Maybe the stress of cheating turns a person into a psycho, especially if they are a decent person at heart. Even so, temporary insanity can be a defense against murder. But that doesn't apply to cheating. I could have begged Brenda not to go, told her I knew the whole story. But nothing about our situation would have changed. She's past the point of no return. So my goal was retribution, not reconciliation. Tudwell was to be severely punished, and it was to be a shining example of hacking. First, I needed pictures, the more candid the better. Then I was going to dox Turd's sordid life to everyone on his contact list, his wife, his mom, his pastor, all the way up to the commander and possibly the Secretary of the Air Force. The beauty of it was that I wouldn't leave fingerprints. After all, incriminating evidence would be sent from Turd's own cell phone. He'd know it was me. And everyone else would be wondering why the guy decided to end his career and his personal life. Having access to a person's fate in one hand is intoxicating. And then I'd really kick his ass. I was going to post his information. Name, date of birth, social security number, all of it on every bulletin board in the dark web. By the end of the day, Turd would have 150 new mortgages and a couple thousand new Visa cards. Plus, Interpol and the FBI will want to talk to him. After the fruits of this atrocity fell to the ground, I planned to send the dude a note, no doubt to his new address under the bridge abutment. Really, Thud, don't thank me. It was my pleasure. Revenge really is best served cold. The trip takes 4 hours by car, so I didn't get to Alamogordo until closer to 2 p.m. Time-wise, it's more like an hour and a half at 120 miles per hour. Brenda's Dynally H3 was parked in the desert behind the Quality Inn and Suites on White Sands Boulevard. It was the yellow and white car she particularly likes to fly. Since Brenda had already arrived, I figured I could start chopping nuts right away. It was a regular chain hotel serving Holloman Air Force Base. I entered the lobby in business attire. The guy behind the counter didn't look up. I sat down in one of the chairs in the lobby and used my iPad. All it took was a simple fake receptionist. The two men were in room 217. Tadwell had booked it under his own name. I thought, what an arrogant fool! I don't like messy confrontations. They accomplish nothing and get out of hand. My profession gives me access to cool military toys. That's why I brought the aardvark with me. It was one of those technological marvels that came out of Afghanistan. Our guys want to know the situation before they break in the door. That's why they use the aardvark. It gave me everything I needed to take down Tudwell. I sipped a decent hazelnut coffee while I used the Filmmaker Pro program to create a 60-second clip of Turd's greatest hits. I intentionally made it short. Some servers have size filters, and I wanted the whole world to witness Tudwell's betrayal. I made it clear that Turd, in his cinematic debut, was an extremely unfaithful husband. As soon as I got home, I planned to throw Tudwell to the piranhas in the dark web. But to do that, I needed the anonymity of the Tor browser. No one in their right mind would dare enter that scary place without a cover. At exactly 3 o'clock, the elevator door opened and out stepped Richard Tudwell. He paid no attention to me. Why should he? I wasn't supposed to be there. Fortunately for my sanity, his phone rang just as he started to cross the lobby. He cheerfully answered it. There was a long pause while someone spoke. Then a look of bewilderment and soon horror appeared on Turda. He argued for a few seconds. Then the interlocutor abruptly hung up. Turd ran to his car in a panic and sped back down White Sands Boulevard. Apparently his wife or boss had just looked over his little indiscretion. I was savoring the beginning and end of Turd's overly titled life when the elevator jingled again and my wife stepped out of it. She looked both gorgeous and pensive. It was clear she was troubled at heart. Lowering her eyes, she headed toward the back of the motel where her helicopter was parked. It was an adulterer's walk of shame. Then she felt someone's presence in front of her. She stopped and looked up, irritation red in her eyes. The look turned to one of incomprehension, and then it hit her. It's called vasovagal syncope. It's caused by shock. The more common term is fainting. First, her eyes reflected pure amazement. Then they rolled back into her head. I picked her up and dragged her graceful little body to the nearest couch in the lobby. The last thing I wanted to do was make a scene. Luckily, the guy behind the counter had disappeared. I sat her down there, still supporting her with my arm. She came to her senses almost instantly, looking confused, and then noticed who she was leaning on. Her sigh was loud enough for anyone in the hall to hear. Fortunately, there was no one else there but us. I said as kindly as possible, I don't want you to explain anything. All I want to do is make the necessary final preparations. Brenda's face crumbled. She said in a voice full of grief, My God, Davy. This wasn't supposed to happen. I thought, what did you think, Sherlock? But I replied, you know the business I'm in. She grabbed me by the shoulders in a panic and said, you have to let me explain. Things are not what they seem. I thought, they never seem to have fresh or original lines. I said, that's exactly what it looks like, my dear. Would you like a repeat? I clicked the icon on my iPad. Tears appeared on her face. She dropped her head in her arms and sobbed uncontrollably, muttering over and over, you weren't supposed to know. We still had the lobby to ourselves, and I wanted to avoid a tantrum. So I pointed to the ladies' room and said, why don't you go in there and pull yourself together, and we'll talk at home tonight. I have a long journey ahead of me. She nodded, misery written all over the features of her beautiful face. She said pitifully, I love you, Davy, only you. I stood up, looked at her sitting on the couch, and said quite sincerely and honestly, I love you too, Brenda. That's why this is so hard. It's getting late now. We'll talk at home. I turned on my heels and walked as calmly as possible toward the parking lot. The sounds of a woman crying rang in my ears. I was starting to feel wobbly myself, so I stopped at the first establishment that led north. I needed a drink. The waitress, who looked like an exhibit from a museum of tattoos and piercings, brought me a beer. The beer was simply necessary. I began to feel the effects of the shock, nausea and chills. I realized that I needed to get back in the truck quickly or I wouldn't make it home. As I drove, I was happily contemplating the storm of shit I had unleashed on Tadwell. The look of absolute horror on his face was priceless, and the best part was that he hadn't seen anything yet. The truly painful part will be when Dark Web is done with him. Like I said, there were far better ways to get revenge than ending up in prison, like destroying the bastard for life. However, there was also the pathetic little bird whose soul I had just crushed. I could see it in her eyes. She knew her worth. It wasn't about misguided trust or my ego. That's a simplistic view of cheating. The exclusive bond was broken, and all aspects of our special connection were gone. We can never say, it's just you and me forever. The ghost of Richard Turd Tadwell will always stand between us and say, but I was there too. We all have our weaknesses, every one of us. Some lucky people manage to go through life without being exploited. But more often than not, your personal weaknesses become your undoing. Worse, there is always collateral damage. For example, when the person you supposedly cherish most turns out to be dragged into the abyss with you. That was the reality the two of us faced now. As for me, I was experiencing that empty feeling you get when you realize you're in the shit without a paddle. I had to take active steps to deal with Brenda's infidelity. But what should I do? Divorce her? Bury her in the backyard? Live like a cuckold? I don't like cuckolds or murderers. So Dr. Number 1 seemed like the only viable option. We'd talk. But Brenda was a stranger to me now. I had no idea what could have motivated her to do such a hurtful thing. It was completely out of character for the woman I thought I knew. I assumed we had a shared vision for our future. Obviously, that was not the case. There would be no more happy moments, no more enjoying the little things in life, no more growing old together. It would be an agonizing parting for both of us. We were just two strangers, alone in a strange land. It was already completely dark when I drove through the Mockingbird Mountains and into the desert area leading to State Road 525. Blake Shelton's song, When Somebody Knows You That Well, was playing on Sirius XM. There was a sad irony in the lyrics. I drove through the bleak landscape of the Sonoran Desert. It was hard to believe that the future of humanity was being laid out on this barren wasteland. Our modern era began at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945. It was at that moment that the proof of concept for a nuclear device blossomed on the desert sand in front of me. Its code name was Trinity. Robert Oppenheimer had coined it ostensibly as a reference to the poetry of John Donne. But American physicist Ken Bainbridge put it best. Now we're all sons of bitches. Splitting the atom has changed every aspect of human existence. The scientist who did it had no idea if their little gadget would work and what would happen when they pressed the button. So they wanted to conduct the test as far away from civilization as possible. The U.S. Air Force Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range was the perfect place to do it. It was in the middle of 100 miles of forbidding wasteland, full of nothing but lizards and snakes. There was only one structure within a 20-mile radius, the building where the bomb was assembled. When they finished, they hoisted their creation onto a 100-foot steel tower that stood on 4 piers 20 feet into the desert. The world then witnessed the dawn of the atomic age. The explosion turned sand into a new radioactive material called trinitite, and Oppenheimer, who was a bit of a bard, said, "I have now become death, the destroyer of worlds." I was approaching the access road leading to the Trinity facility itself. The landscape was decorated with the strange silvery light that a night sky with trillions of stars and a full moon gives off. The road was on my right and clearly visible. The headlights swept over the historical marker, and a small figure appeared at the intersection, looking straight at me. It was the strangest, most startling vision imaginable. I braked and stopped. An alien-looking creature stepped into the cone of my headlights. It was a young woman of unearthly beauty, small but unusually graceful. I realized she was unusually slender because she was wearing a tight-fitting black suit that encased her from neck to boots. Her skin was a perfect alabaster color, and her lovely round face was elfin, with huge, wide-set green eyes and short black hair. Big deal, Tinkerbell in a cat costume. The costume had some kind of strange insignia on it above her left breast, and on her right arm she wore a device similar to the monitors worn by U-2 airplane pilots. I knew there were several out-of-state airfields in this part of the woods, including Stallion AFB, which I was to pass by. So pardon me if I assumed it came out of a spy plane. I jumped out of the truck. She stood there on a pair of long, slender legs, one thigh off to the side, and looked at me puzzled. It was an odd reaction for someone who had just parachuted down from 65,000 feet. I asked worriedly, "Are you all right, ma'am? Can I take you somewhere where you can contact your people?" She replied in a strangely melodic voice, "No, thank you. I was just getting my bearings. It's confusing here." It was a strange answer. Like she was refusing to drive home from work. I said, "There's nothing for miles around, ma'am. At least let me take you to a place where you can make a phone call." "How did you get here?" She looked at me like I was an idiot and replied, "Through a portal, of course." "Why?" "Okay, things got even weirder." I tried to speak in an even voice so as not to upset the crazy woman. "And where is this portal, ma'am?" She waved her hand vaguely toward the northeast and replied, "Over there, it's a long walk." She gestured in the direction of the black obelisk marking ground zero, 4 miles away. I said, still trying to make conversation. "Just to be clear, you got here through a portal that transported you from another place, yes? And where exactly is that other place?" She made a sound like a combination of a cough and a sigh and looked at me expectantly. Then she added, "I had to leave. It wasn't safe there." So, to summarize, this gorgeous little creature was running from an undefined problem that happened somewhere mysterious and ended up in the middle of the night in the Sonoran Desert. There was a shadow portal here, which she treated like a subway stop. Perhaps you can understand my bewilderment. Add to this my recent experience with marital infidelity, and you can probably imagine the level of stress that caused me to have a stroke. Still, I couldn't just leave her there. I said, trying to sound reasonable, "It's not safe here either, ma'am. Why don't you get in the truck and I'll take you to a place where you can get help?" Whether that would be psychological help or just roadside assistance was debatable. She looked hesitant. I said, "Look, I'm not going to take you somewhere you don't want to go." I could see that was exactly what she was thinking. There was an ominous vibe coming from this woman about the cosplay intergalactic refugee meme. I added, continuing to sound reasonable. "Since the 18th century, this area has been called Death's Journey. There are only snakes and predators around us, and you won't last long alone." At that moment, a coyote nearby let out a dramatic howl. My little psycho flinched and said pleadingly, "You're not going to touch me?" I replied, "Why would you think that?" Of course, only a few microns of mylar separated her from full nudity. And she really did have the most exquisite body imaginable in Playboy or beyond. So I guess I could understand her concern. I added, "Look, I have my own problems. If you get in the truck, I'll tell you an entertaining story. My new acquaintance may have just come from the Kof-Psi planet." But she was clearly interested in what I had just told her, and the coyote added a convincing amount of menace. So she hesitantly walked over to the passenger side of the 150, got in, and moved close to the door. For a while we drove in silence. Then she asked, "So, what's the story?" I laughed and replied, "The events of my miserable life are of no interest to you. I just told you this to make you act sensibly. People die here, you know." She looked worried. She had such a perfectly proportioned face and such delicate features that she looked like a porcelain angel against her warm alabaster skin. I said sympathetically, "Where are your men? Where are you going? Who can I call?" She still looked distraught. Finally, she said pitifully, "I don't know anyone on this planet. It's just the place where the portal was set up when I jumped through the event horizon." "Okay, time to mess with the crazy woman." I said kindly, "So what made you jump? Why did you do it?" It must have been the first time she had thought about the reason since it happened. She looked at me in horror and replied, "It was horrible. The growling, roaring, hissing was killing everyone. It was my only way out," I said, trying to keep my voice reasonable. "So you were fleeing from something I can't pronounce. Who are they?" She replied, "They are intergalactic predators, and my planet is their new feeding ground. I was lucky enough to be on shift at the transporter center when they showed up." From her tone, it felt like everyone knew about the growl and hiccups. Then she paused and seemed to be thinking about something. She added soothingly, "Don't worry. I closed the portal when I jumped. They won't be able to come here now. Well, at least this conversation was more interesting than country music. I said, okay, let's assume you are who you say you are. Then why do you look human and why can we communicate in English except for a few words? She cheerfully replied, English? Is that the name of your language? Then she added, I am speaking directly into your mind. But some of the things we discuss have no concepts that can be translated. So, my little geek claimed to be a telepath. She continued, all life forms of our type came from the same basic structure. It is nature's most efficient structure. So, of course, we are alike. I laughed and said, you have an answer for everything, don't you? She smiled sweetly and replied, so why are you so sad? This shocked me. I replied, how do you know I'm sad? It must have been my body language. She added in a voice full of innocent curiosity, is it because your friend was just brought by another male? I braked, stopping the truck right in the middle of the road, and stared at her in amazement. I asked anxiously, how do you know that? Who are you? She replied, my name is Stella, and as I said, I come from the coughing sigh in the Perseus arm of our galaxy. Your sun is in the outer arm. So we're practically neighbors. She smiled flirtatiously at me, then sat there looking at me as if she just made a joke. Don't bother telling me. Of course I knew she was delusional. But to play a joke on her, I said, if you're from an advanced alien race, why are you here in the middle of the howling desert? One would think your ancestors would have set up an arrival point somewhere more convenient and civilized. She said, as if lecturing a child, builders set up a portal at a point where they discover irrefutable evidence that a culture has evolved enough to merit study. I said, so the explosion of the first atomic bomb was like a signal flare for your people. Gah. Now I was starting to sound like her. She nodded and replied, yes, there are billions of civilizations in our galaxy, but only the advanced ones are of interest. She said it as if everyone should know it. Crazy continued, the builders actually prefer a remote access point. It allows them to come and go in secret. We have been scouting your planet for over 70 years. We even lost one of our first expeditions not far from here. She must have been referring to Roswell. The woman was undoubtedly suffering from some sort of psychosis. Seriously, she actually believed she was an alien. So I couldn't just drop her off at the bus station in Albuquerque. After all, it would be wrong to abandon such a crazy woman. The problem was that I was rushing home to negotiate the end of my marriage. And I realized the conversation would be heated if I showed up with that delicious morsel in tow. It would be like pouring a gallon of gasoline on a raging fire. So no pressure, Stella said sympathetically. You can just leave me alone if I'm in the way of you meeting your buddy. I didn't hit the brakes. I was used to her reading my facial expressions, like she was reading my mind. Still, I realized I'd been betrayed. My new friend was clearly a decent person. I said, I don't know your story, but I can't just throw you away. I have to help you. A beauty like hers wouldn't last 2 minutes on the dirty streets of Albuquerque. I said, I don't know how you know that. But you're right. I just saw my wife with another man, and in my culture that is the grossest form of betrayal. Now I'm coming home to discuss the terms of our separation. Culture? I had to watch myself or she would drag me into her delusion. Stargirl Stella was very convincing. She nodded and said, yes, that's the way it is in most family cultures. It guarantees the origin of the offspring. In my world, it doesn't matter since all children are raised by the central dwarf. I assumed that was her untranslatable word for government. She added earnestly, of course, couples can choose to have an exclusive union. It's very romantic. But the grunting hiccup they implant in themselves during the initiation ceremony kills them if they engage in extramarital relations after being bound. Grunting was obviously a technology. Maybe we should get one of those too. It would certainly make couples take fidelity more seriously. I smiled at the thought and said, we haven't gotten to that point yet. But our technology is good enough that you can always tell if a person has strayed. That's how I caught my wife. And the guy who seduced her will definitely wish he was dead when I'm done ruining his life, Stella said, reflecting. I've never had the desire to commit. It's too sad to be limited to just one man. On the other hand, sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be so committed to a man. I replied, it's beautiful and scary. The intimacy that two people share far outweighs the lack of diversity in partners. Damn, I forgot! Our exclusivity was already past tense. I tried to remain calm. After all, I was talking to a crazy person. But I couldn't drown out the ranting in my head. It was the same archetypal duality that infidelity breeds. I loved Brenda and hated her, and the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that killing Tadwell wasn't such a bad idea. Stella said encouragingly, "Killing another man is not the answer. You've already done much worse for him by making him look like a predator. You need to talk to your friend and find out why she did what she did. Not knowing will prevent you from moving on." Okay, this was getting creepy. I said, "My mind is in turmoil right now. I don't know how you're doing this." But you're right. I want Tadwell to live a long and miserable life. But Brenda is a different matter. I tried to explain. You can't just turn off your feelings for someone who is such an important part of your life. My wife and I had an exceptional bond. It was a living thing. Now she's dead. I can feel it. So my feelings of alienation are not a matter of ego or jealousy. It's a permanent psychological block. I've lost all faith in her. My gorgeous little girl star sympathetically added, "Yes, I feel that." You do? Do you feel the end of other people's hopes and dreams? I dutifully said, "My rational mind tells me that I should forgive and forget. But my heart won't let me do that. I would make up with Brenda in a heartbeat if everything happened by chance. But I know she met him more than once. So it was a planned and deliberate betrayal. Now I have a long and agonizing process of unraveling our lives." It helped me to say it out loud, even if it was to a crazy person. It also reminded me that a supposed alien from the planet Koffsai was sitting next to me. I asked, hoping to get the truth out of her. "Honestly, can't you contact anyone?" She replied pitifully. "Not within a 6,000 to 7,000 light-year radius, and they've probably already been eaten." She turned her sweet, tear-stained face to me and said pitifully, "You are my only hope. I must put myself in your hands." Great. I had just adopted a gorgeous stray kitten, and at the same time I was getting rid of a cheating wife. Why me? Worse yet, this woman looked like a Sports Illustrated cover girl. I was sure her presence wouldn't go to waste in my divorce proceedings with Brenda. But what else could I do? I planned my first moves as I pulled off the I-25 freeway and headed north. I knew I needed to find a place to stay for the night. After all, I couldn't live with my soon-to-be ex-wife. So I decided that I would drop off my star girlfriend first and drive myself to the house. The Marriott Albuquerque Hotel was a 15-story monolith in close proximity to where I lived. It was overly grand and expensive for my taste. But I wanted to park my car in an anonymous place, and nothing beats a big conference room-style hotel for anonymity. I'll go back and try to decide what to do with Stella once I've worked out ground rules with Brenda and gathered a few essentials to get by. I asked her to stay in the car while I checked us in. She asked, "Why?" I didn't bother to explain that we would probably end up in the pages of the Albuquerque Journal if I walked her through the lobby. She was so spectacular, especially in her tight outfit. So I told her, "You never know. The authorities may be looking for aliens." A look of absolute terror appeared on her face, and she said anxiously, "I'll wait." I saw what they did to the people on the ship that crashed. Apparently, she had a vision of being dissected like a lab rat. Check-in took a little while because I had to look for a room with twin beds. I walked out the back door and escorted Stella up the stairs to our room. The sight of her incredible, almost naked buns climbing 14 stories in a catsuit left me confused. As soon as we entered the room, she began wandering around as if she had never seen such luxury. I asked her, "Aren't there places like this on your planet?" I had already given up trying to be rational with her. She replied, "No, my planet is the same size as yours, but we have 100 times the population. That's why we live like rodents in small rooms in huge towers, each with only the bare essentials." I thought she had just described Manhattan. But I said, "Try to relax. It's going to take some time." I showed her how to work the TV. She acted like she'd never seen anything so ancient. But she was immediately fixated on the cosmetics commercials. I closed the door while she stared passionately into the TV and took the elevator down to the truck. It was nearing midnight. It had been a long day, and tomorrow, with a good night's sleep, I would begin the agonizing process of figuring out why Brenda had betrayed me. But I needed to finish the preliminary preparations. My wife was lying on the living room couch when I entered. She was in her old tattered robe. She looked devastated and beautiful. My appearance woke her up. She stirred, wiggled her gorgeous bare legs to sit up, and timidly said, "Hi, you're home at last." I replied softly and lovingly, "Because you can't just call off 14 years of happy marriage." "Yes, I need to get some things and make arrangements to talk to you tomorrow. I also wanted to make sure you were okay." She got up and ran over to me. She put her head on my chest, crying hard, and said, Oh my God, Davy. I'm so sorry. I never expected this to happen. I'm such a fool. I put my arms around her and stroked her back while she cried. I said, perhaps too harshly, well, it happened. Now we both need to decide how to deal with the aftermath. We can start that process in the morning. But I'm so exhausted emotionally that I don't want to do anything but sleep right now. She leaned back in my arms, threw me a sizzling look and said, let's go to bed. I want to start making it up to you. I smiled weakly and said, that's not going to happen, Brenda. I just need to get a few of my things and I'll be out of here. We can talk later. The next 15 minutes were agonizing. My wife, the woman I'd loved for almost a third of my life, followed me around, crying pitifully and begging me to stay while I gathered my clothes, toiletries, and laptop. Finally, I stopped, turned to her, and said angrily, listen, what did you expect? Did you really think I would agree to you having fun with this jerk as payment for staying married to you? I'd never spoken to her like that before. This was her first hint that the consequences could be fatal. She began to whine. It was only for a couple weeks. You weren't supposed to find out. I was so careful. This confirmed my suspicions. It was deliberate. My heart exploded like the Death Star. I said, maybe a little ruthlessly, you play, you pay, now we've both lost. I need to get out of here, or I'm going to say some things I'll regret later. I closed my roller bag, grabbed my laptop, and walked out to the truck. Brenda followed me the whole way, wailing, don't go! Please don't go. I'll do anything. It was heartbreaking. I'm a nerd. So, of course, I had to analyze everything. First, it was obvious that Brenda didn't have a plan B. She expected to have a little fun and then go back to life as my loving wife, and her husband would be none the wiser. Second, whatever her motives, she always knew she was doing the wrong thing. And finally, her motives were more intricate than just helping Turd in a time of need. My wife was a nurturer, right down to the tips of her nails covered in colored nail polish. That certainly explained her strange fascination with Dick Bright rehab. And yet it did not explain why she cheated on me. Of course, Brenda had to believe that the situation was temporary. And since neither husband was hurt during the fulfillment of her fantasy, her actions were appropriate, at least in her own mind. I didn't like it and I didn't sympathize with her. But I did understand her. After all, Richard Turd Tadwell was the one who needed to be held accountable. Turd probably saw it as part of the game he'd been playing throughout his protracted adolescence. Tough guys were getting hot chicks. So naturally, Turd wanted my wife. Of course, I blamed Brenda too. But it was Tadwell's scheming that had led her to the dark side. So I had no intention of sicking the hellhounds of the darknet on Brenda, as I intended to do with Tudwell. Nevertheless, the marriage was consummated. History. And nothing but time travel could revive it. And then my thoughts returned to my little starlet. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning when I entered the house, trying to be as quiet as possible. To my utter surprise, instead of sleeping soundly, Stella was lying on the bed. She said, I knew you'd need comforting after talking to your buddy. What the hell kind of female compassion was that? First Brenda, now her. Are all women whores? Then I felt her touch on my mind and she recoiled, jumping to her feet. Panting, she quickly threw on one of those fluffy white hotel robes. She looked terrible. The robe was 3 or 4 sizes too big for her, making her look like a 6-year-old. Her perfect face went from alabaster to fiery red. She gasped, I'm so sorry. I saw it. It was life-changing. I had no idea. I angrily replied, saw what? Her little charade was starting to get annoying. Or maybe I was just getting fed up with other people, especially women. She said simply, how inappropriate my actions were. You are in conflict. You don't want to part with your mate. But you don't understand how you can be with her. I looked stunned. Could she really be a mind reader? She added sympathetically, she's not really an obstacle herself. You know she only wants you. It's the disrespect, the deliberate attempt to deceive you, that is what seems intractable to you. You don't know how you will be able to maintain your dignity if you ignore the lack of respect she has shown you by entering into a secret relationship. Okay, I didn't know how she did it. But that was the problem. It was a matter of preserving my pride. Pride is the deadliest sin because it's directly related to who you are. Lust, greed, gluttony, sloth, envy, anger are direct transgressions. You can overcome them by suppressing desire. But pride is innate. Pride dictates how you perceive yourself and how you behave. If you have too much pride, you're a vain asshole. If you have too little, you are a weakling. The problem is that the mindset required to maintain an acceptable balance has to be constantly adjusted with each new challenge. Otherwise, you sacrifice your self-esteem. I could have beaten Brenda Tadwell if she had managed to convince me that she had learned her lesson. The real trauma was that she had knowingly conspired to share herself with a guy I hated. This violation required an appropriate response, or I would lose all sense of self-worth and dignity. For me, the only acceptable response to willful betrayal would have been to dissolve the marriage. Of course, Brenda would have her own excuses. On the surface, they may seem convincing. But what do you say to a person who decides to cheat and then lies about it? What could Brenda say to me that would convince me that she wouldn't do it again? It was a real existential dilemma. Sartre would have been pleased. Stella was clearly watching my thoughts as these feelings raced through my head. And yes, I was beginning to believe she could do it. Her beautiful face reflected my emotions as I worked through the situation. She eagerly said, "I will be your companion." Now we are both single. That remained to be worked out. But it was late, and I had a busy day ahead of me. I asked, "Do you mind if we sleep now?" She nodded and replied, "Our sleep cycles are not like yours. But I need to shut off my mind, and the darkness helps me do that." That was interesting. Was she really a robot? I turned off the light because I didn't want to think about it. Brenda met me at the door. She looked terrible. She said sadly, "Polly called me a whore last night." Apparently, she saw the video that Tude sent out to the world. "I didn't see it since I'm not on his contact list." I looked skeptical. She replied, embarrassed, "He deleted me from his phone when we started dating. He said he wanted to avoid suspicion." I thought, what an idiot. Brenda said, "I saw the clip and all the incriminating text messages. By the way, thank you for editing me out. I don't know how I could look my friends in the eye after witnessing these dirty deeds." She sadly added, "I don't know why Richard sent these things out. But he's ruined his life. Polly is divorcing him and the BBC is launching an investigation. Adultery is a crime in the military, you know." Then she realized what else she was implying and added hastily, "I haven't spoken to Richard since my world ended. Polly told me all this. I could have warned Brenda that Turd's current problems were only the tip of the iceberg. I had far more diabolical thoughts about how his life would turn out when I got to the dark web. But that would remain between me and Turd. My current goal was to find an acceptable way out of the marriage. As we had every morning for the past 14 years, we sat at the kitchen table and sipped a delicious French roast. I'm sure I looked as stunned as she did. Her eyes were puffy and red from crying. Her hair was disheveled and she looked like she hadn't had a good night's sleep. People react to betrayal in different ways. Those who react to betrayal more impulsively lose control of themselves. They whine, scream, throw things, and engage in self-destructive behavior. This happens because they are frustrated with their inability to change the injustice of their circumstances. I suppose that's great if you're like this. The tantrums may even feel good in the moment. But it's self-destructive. You gain nothing but more rage and frustration. And shit happens. The key to preserving your personal pride lies in how you react. Brenda and I both had a tough attitude. It was part of our attraction. We were practical people. We always managed to accept the things we couldn't change, and we had the wisdom to know the difference. We also understood that circumstances were what they were. We were now determined to deal with them as civilized as we could. We had had 14 good years. None of us wanted to mar those happy times. So there would be no melodrama. Just two people who once loved each other, dealing with an unimaginable tragedy in the most constructive way possible. She looked at me seriously, searching for a modicum of hope. I stared back with inevitability. At last she said pitifully, "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded. She continued, "I knew it as soon as I saw the video clip. I swear he meant nothing to me, and that makes my actions even more incomprehensible." I continued to just stare at her, shocked. She sighed and said with an ironic chuckle, "It's for the best. I probably wouldn't respect you if you wanted to stay married." Brenda was a very tough and pragmatic woman. I said, "It wasn't about sex. It was bad enough. But the cheating was the deciding factor." Then I paused. I couldn't hold back any longer. I said with deep sadness, "Why did you conspire with that pathetic asshole to cheat on me?" Her face turned white. She lowered her head and sobbed, the wings of her hair hiding her face. I waited. At last, she pulled herself together, wiped her eyes, and said with strain in her voice, "When do you think I fell?" The question caught me off guard. I shrugged my shoulders and asked, confused, "Why does it matter?" She replied, Because it proves what a stupid woman I am. She paused and gathered her thoughts. Then she said, up until the time we fought over Richard, I hadn't done anything that didn't pass my husband's scrutiny. Perhaps he was giving me signs, but I was too stupid to notice them. So I thought your concerns were misplaced and foolish. The next time he came over, I told Richard what you had told me, and he assured me that he would not stop by again. That's when it happened. I thought the situation was resolved, and I was about to walk him to the door. But first I took our coffee cups to the sink. He came up behind me, grabbed me, and kissed me aggressively. I wasn't expecting that. I hesitated, confused and lost in that instant. She made a sheepish look and said, he just stuck his hand down my pants and started rubbing my little button. You know what that kind of touch does to me? I turned into a crazy person. The worst part was that I had the biggest orgasm of my life, several times. Brenda saw my agony and added softly, it had nothing to do with the man. It was the situation, the fact that it was all very screwed up. She added sadly, and then there was accounting. I consider myself a moral person. I didn't want it at first, really. Brenda gave me a grim smile and replied, my self-image couldn't handle the truth. Because otherwise I was just a slut and I wouldn't have gone willingly. I refrained from commenting. Really? Are you asking me if I believed her? The answer is totally. A normal person would have made a mental note and moved on. But a sociopath like Turd would have seen Brenda's hotness as an opportunity and certainly as his right. When Sir Edmund Hillary was asked why he climbed Mount Everest, he replied, because he had to. It was the same with Brenda. She was there. So Turd had to rise to the challenge, so to speak. Why did he commit such a heinous act? Because he could. It was part and parcel of his need to prove, or perhaps more correctly assure himself, that he is as powerful and empowered as he believes himself to be. It is the hallmark of a true narcissist, someone who has no idea that other people have feelings. Brenda made a grimace and said, never underestimate the power of guilt in a good Catholic girl. My promiscuous behavior was killing me, so I desperately needed a way to forgive myself. Then she hesitantly added, and it was obvious I wasn't going to like this part. Then Richard started to let a tear fall. He told me how much I meant to him, how I had saved his life. So that was my convenient absolution. I saved a sweet, sensitive, and misunderstood soul from a bad situation. Brenda wrinkled her nose and said, I won't lie. It was amazing. It was so unusual, so excitingly forbidden. I knew it was wrong. But I justified myself by saying that you'd never know. So it wouldn't hurt you. It was a sad delusion. But what was I supposed to do? Her voice dropped to a whisper. She said guiltily, the seal was broken. I was the deceiver. So yes, I met him 3 more times. It was the same as the last time. I would fly in and we would meet at the hotel. She realized how much she had upset me. She took my hand in both of hers, searched my face with her eyes and said, I was 2 people. The larger part of me was your devoted wife. I have not lost an inch of my love or respect for you. She ended by saying, ironically, I just told him it was the last time. He said he wanted me to remember me 1 more time, and I was already in the room. And I thought, why not? It's pathetic. She paused and said, that's my story. I know you and I realize the consequences. I take full responsibility for my actions and will sign any agreement you offer me. I will do this because I love you and I know it's the right thing to do. I finally realized that. You can admire an opponent after a tough fight. That's exactly how I felt about my soon-to-be ex-wife. In one of her incarnations, Brenda might have been a cheating whore. But right now, the woman I loved was running things. After all, this woman closed the books with class. I hugged her as I left. I said, I'll contact Jim Eastman. He was our family lawyer. Since the divorce will be relatively amicable, he will be able to represent both of us. I added, and then I'll disappear for a while. I need to lick some wounds and I want to do it in a private place. I'll have to coordinate that with Sandia. But they owe me a favor. So I don't think they'll mind. She put her hand on my cheek, looked sadly into my eyes and said, I understand and I'm sorry. I'll be here if you change your mind. Closing the door, she cried. I drove to the nearest park and threw up. All that was in front of me now was a barren landscape. It was horrible. It's funny how people's moral stance changes depending on the circumstances. I was divorcing Brenda because she was hiding something from me. At the same time, I was cohabitating with a woman who was far more beautiful than even my gorgeous wife. And Brenda was clueless. So who's the liar now? Of course, I couldn't tell Brenda that this particular woman was with me because she was from another planet. And by the way, did I mention she's telepathic? They would have locked me in a rubber room. I was also sure Brenda would have a hard time accepting any assurances that our relationship was purely platonic, especially once she got a glimpse of Stella. Thus, even though I had temporarily cleared the deck in one area, an even stranger problem awaited me on the way out. When I returned, Stella was still in her robe. She was staring mesmerized at the TV, which was running an episode of Friends. She excitedly said, "I'm studying the culture of Earth." I highly doubted that Chandler, Ross, Joey, Monica, or Rachel were from any culture outside of TV land. But I asked, "Have you eaten anything?" She cheerfully replied, "Yes, I ate my daily waffle," and pointed to the thing on my wrist. She pulled one of the waffles out of her wrist device and showed it to me. It was a half-inch cube. All I could think of was Soylent Green. I asked, "Would you like anything else?" She replied satisfactorily, "No, this has everything I need for the next 24 hours. I asked, "And you live on this?" She replied, "Of course, it's a complete diet." I asked, "Does it taste good?" I ordered room service food for myself. She looked at me puzzled and replied, "Why? Does it have to have flavor?" A thought struck me. She really is convincingly portraying someone who has never lived on Earth. Except I didn't believe it. It was too corny. I asked, "How old are you?" She replied absent-mindedly, still watching the antics of the oddball gang at Central Perk. 277 on my next birthday. She looked 26. I whistled and said jokingly, "You're holding up pretty well for an old girl." She replied angrily, "What do you mean old? I've only lived a quarter of my normal life." I didn't argue with this crazy woman. Instead, I said, "We'll have to buy you some clothes. You can't walk around in what you came to Earth in." She insultingly replied, "What's wrong with my suit?" "It's the latest in perm or hick on a cough sigh." I nodded toward the screen and said, "You're going to have to look more like these women if you want to fit in. Otherwise, people might start thinking you're not from around here." A waggle of eyebrows and a wink conveyed the concept of alien autopsy. She looked horrified and said, "How can I wear something else? This is all I have." I was visited by inspiration. I said, "Your current outfit won't look out of place at Walmart. We can buy you clothes there." At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and the room service guy rolled in a tray of bagels and lox. I tried to tip him, but he couldn't take his eyes off Stella. On the way out, he bumped into the door. I spread cream cheese on the bagel and said, "Try this. It's what we eat here." She took a bite. Her eyes rolled and she shuddered with her whole body. It was as if she had just had an orgasm. She said, panting, "Is that what it tastes like?" An hour later, we were walking into the Walmart Supercenter on San Mateo. Stella was bumping into the window displays now and then and looking around mesmerized. As mesmerized, she said, "Look at all these beautiful things." I had never heard anyone say that about Walmart merchandise. The Chinese would have been honored. Brenda spent 2 hours at the racks of clothes in the back of the store and another 40 minutes in the cosmetics department. She said seriously, "I learned about all this from the Home Shopping Network." I really wanted to cut Stella out of my life. She was making life very difficult, and her alien behavior made it hard to focus on the chores I was supposed to be doing. It was like looking after a 5-year-old child. But unlike a child, Stella literally stopped traffic everywhere she went. I was especially worried about not being seen in public with her. At least not until things were back on track. My soon-to-be ex-wife didn't deserve such a revelation. Yeah, I knew it was Brenda's fault. But tough guys don't party in the end zone after a touchdown. It's just not classy. I could have told Brenda about Stella. But what good would that do? It's not like I cheated on my soon-to-be ex-wife. We were already divorced. So when we got back to the room, I said, "Tonight I want to take you out to dinner. It's going to be just like we Earthlings do. We'll dress up and spend the evening talking. You've seen it on TV, right?" She nodded readily. I asked, "Would you like to do that?" My star girl got very excited. Apparently, she had seen something like this on Real Housewives and wanted to try it. She also wanted to continue her tasting experiment. I said, "I have some personal preparations to make. I'll be back around 6 o'clock to pick you up." There was no way I wanted to talk about Stella's future while we were cooped up in our room. I spent the day making plans for the divorce. It would be an easy divorce since everything was amicable. Easy if you ignored the heartache that would follow. Part of me still wondered why I was doing this. Until the ghost of Richard Tadwell appeared and said, Yeah, why do it, man? She's so cool. Thanks, Tud. That was just the reminder I needed. I also arranged to take a couple of weeks off. My team could do without me, and the bureaucrats didn't care what I did as long as I covered their asses. I needed to help Stella. Whether that help would be psychological or astrophysical remained to be seen. Stella was ready when I got back. She was breathtaking. But I just stood there with my mouth open. She, for her part, looked absolutely terrified. She must have used a source like YouTube to learn how to apply makeup. Up until that point, she hadn't worn any makeup at all. The enhancement had elevated her extraterrestrial beauty to intergalactic class. We were just on our way downstairs to a restaurant that couldn't be called 5-star. But we had no chance of getting into one of the high-end establishments without Stella being noticed. She might even attract the paparazzi. A woman that beautiful should be famous, right? The last thing I wanted was for Brenda to think I was waiting for a replacement. And not because I was trying not to be vindictive. It was just that I knew our divorce would go down a much less constructive path if Brenda thought I was changing her. Stella asked anxiously, "Do I look good? Is this what you expected?" That was probably the biggest understatement since we have a problem with Houston. I wondered if the insecurity gene was built into the X chromosome. My only concern was fighting off predators with a stick. Once we were seated, I ordered food for both of us. I was careful to keep everything tasteless, as Stella claimed to have lived her entire life on what appeared to be fish food. She insisted on trying everything I ordered. She kept throwing speculative glances at me. She knew what we were here for. Remember, she's supposedly a mind reader. Finally, I said, "Okay, so how do we get you back to your world?" She stopped mid-bite and looked unhappy. She asked, "What makes you think I want to go back?" I replied, "Don't you have family or maybe a special person you'd like to go back to?" I know that sounded crazy. But it was much easier to act like she had just flown in from outer space. She became pensive, as if mulling over her answer. She said carefully, "I've never had a family. Children aren't raised that way on Kashla. There's nothing to go back to anyway. They're probably all packed up by now, grunting growing up, hissing. Then she hesitated and added shyly, "Maybe you're my special someone." "Have you ever thought about that?" I said incredulously. "How could you even say that? We've known each other for exactly 24 hours. She tapped herself on the head and replied, "I know everything about you. You have everything I appreciate in a partner. You're kind, decent, smart, funny, and adventurous. I know your current girlfriend made a huge mistake by acting the way she did. I would never make that mistake." And then it hit me. Perhaps this was opening a path forward. But first I needed to confirm something. I looked intently at Stella, trying to read her face, and said, "When I went to bed last night, you said you needed to turn your mind off. What did you mean by that?" I knew the question came out of the blue. I thought it was. Let's see what she answered that question. She laughed and immediately answered, "Our race has always interacted telepathically. We may have communicated by voice in the past as well, but our planet is much older than yours." She added carelessly, "Our telepathic receptors are omnidirectional. It's like human hearing. So there is always background noise. We shield our minds to be polite. People on your planet don't do that. So I have to filter it out, and it's exhausting. It helps me if I can turn off my sensors. It's like your need for sleep." Oh my God, that was too detailed an explanation to be made up. I asked, stunned. "So what you told me is true? You are actually an alien? Yet you remain just a woman? That's like saying the SR-71 Blackbird is just an airplane." But I still couldn't get my head around the fact that the glowing beauty sitting across from me was real. She smiled affectionately at me and replied, "Of course it is. The universe is populated by countless humanoid civilizations. We are all biologically similar. As I said, this is the most efficient configuration." I added, still stunned. "Really? There's a portal to 1,000,000 other worlds in White Sands, and you're really a refugee from another planet?" She said conversationally, as if we were discussing bus stops. "Well, there is another portal in the Jura Mountains right now. It's located near a place called CERN. It was built when your race started experimenting with subatomic particles. I believe it's called the Large Hadron Collider. It's another great achievement." Wow. First I discovered that my wife was having fun with another guy. Now I found myself talking to an actual ET, and it wasn't an ugly little creature with Einstein's eyes. Man, did Spielberg ever get it wrong? Stella smiled radiantly and said, "Now you believe me." I said, a little stunned. "I believe you," she said impatiently. So I can be your companion? I am even willing to go through the initiation ceremony. It will bind us for life, I said, still trembling a little. Let's take it one step at a time. We're not using a killer device to make sure we stay together. She looked puzzled, as if she couldn't understand how we could do otherwise. I smiled affectionately, and for the first time I felt love rather than irritation. She really was a sweet, modest, and simple woman, and I had a feeling that underneath all those alien oddities lurked an unusually pure soul. I said softly, "We need to learn to be bonded, and I am still legally bound to another woman. That has to be officially undone before we can be committed to each other." Well, if I was going to bond with this beautiful little alien woman, I might as well start speaking her language. The jump was unexpected. But you know how it is. I'd felt a natural attraction to Stella almost from the moment I'd discovered her in the desert. She was a perfect woman in the physical sense, a beautiful movie star. But what attracted me to her was her good-natured and happy demeanor. There wasn't a single evil or malicious bone in her. I spent some time looking for a place where we could live. I wanted to find a safe place, not too far from the city, where Stella could begin to get used to Earth and Earth customs. The 2 weeks I took off we spent settling in while I ran up a ridiculous bill at the Marriott. I felt like I needed to hide Stella. I know that sounds hypocritical. After all, it was Brenda's secret affairs that ruined our marriage. But I was hiding my Stargirl for another reason. More importantly, my marriage was already over. It just hadn't been officially dissolved, and I wanted the process to be amicable. Many divorces end in bitterness and animosity. Shit goes down, people get beaten up, and they suffer emotionally. But the process can take place without bitterness and chaos. Brenda and I had enough dignity to interact in a civilized manner. Or maybe we just stuck to the old maxim, never let them see you sweat. Either way, neither of us gave the appearance of being hurt. Instead, we discussed the situation until the end, which, while not ideal, suited us both. It was during one of these discussions that the topic of other people came up. Moving on to others was a simple conclusion. We were both reasonably attractive and heterosexual, so there would inevitably come a point where we would begin to move down that path, Brenda said with embarrassment. Davy, I want to talk about what we should do next. I've been asked out by a lot of men since we broke up, and I want your permission to start dating again. It wasn't as patronizing as it sounded. Obviously, we would both find other men to date. Brenda was beautiful, and of course I had already met my one and only. So I was glad and pleased that she had shown me enough respect to make the first move. I smiled and said, "You have been a wonderful wife, and I know you will be one for the next lucky man. You are a stunningly attractive woman, and it would be criminal to hide your light under a bushel. So we both need to start the process of distancing ourselves from each other." She looked at me sadly. Her facial expression said, "I wish we were moving together instead of apart." I added softly, "We both need a fresh start." I believed that. Once the bond is broken, there is no going back, no matter how much you want to. And if you do go back, it will always be an imperfect compromise with the past. Stella gave me hope for a brighter future. I wanted Brenda to have the same hope. Besides, I was beginning to recognize my Stargirl. Stella might have come from a wormhole in the center of the galaxy, but in personality, it was like she'd flown into town on a bus from Nebraska. She was simple, happy, and cordial, not an implacable alien. Although every now and then I had to warn her to stay out of my head. She kept tiptoeing around like a faithful golden retriever, checking, wanting to reassure. I rented a house in Sandia Heights, which was a quick drive to the National Laboratory via Highway 556. The neighborhood was upscale, but still with a rural bias. Stella had room to spread out without having to worry about close neighbors. The guy I was renting from wanted to sell the apartment, so we made a deal. Once the divorce was finalized, I would buy it for the price he offered. In the meantime, it was taken off the market. The purchase was just a month and a half later. Helping Stella adjust to my world more than made up for any remaining regret of losing Brenda. Stella's world was a preview of Earth's future. It was catastrophically overpopulated and polluted to the point where trillions of its inhabitants were forced to exist inside polymer domes. So, by necessity, their society was extremely regulated and restrictive. Each was assigned a specific role at birth, and they lived their lives doing what they were instructed to do. Stella herself was a console operator at the transportation center. So she was aware of one small thing that was completely out of place in my world. Think of cell phones. They are ubiquitous. Everyone uses them. But few of us understand how the electronics of a cell phone or a cellular network work, or can create one. That's the situation Stella found herself in. She wasn't one of those who created and controlled the technology or directed the work. She was a simple technician. Now let's move to the 18th century. In those days, knowing how to use a cell phone would not have done you any good. At the same time, everyone around you knew how to cope with life better than you did. This was exactly the kind of problem Stella faced, even though she had experience with a world that was light years more advanced. She had to learn how to live here. She spent hours on the internet. The same general concept existed in her world, but access to it was implanted into a person's mind. So all they needed was a thought. Now Stella had to navigate social media and the other garbage of life online. Worse, she had to do it on a device that she thought was a notch above a stone tablet. As Stella learned to speak, dress, and act like a normal Earthwoman, I began to take her places like a normal couple. One night we had dinner at Antiquity Restaurant, which is near Albuquerque's historic plaza. It serves the best Chateaubriand in town. Brenda and I have dined there often in the past. No guy would feel completely safe appearing in public with a woman like Stella. She creates a sensation wherever she appears. Necks craning, people gawking like the people of the African veldt when a lion appears. Yet I wasn't worried about losing her, as she never seemed to notice other people. It was like I was glued to her like a little duckling. Tonight she was wearing a classic black dress with a simple string of pearls. She had such perfect facial features that looking at her was like looking at a work of art. We were sharing a plate of carpaccio, and Stella was so enamored with the little slices of beef that she cooed and purred in my head. At that moment, a sociable voice said, "Hi, Davy. I knew I'd run into you sooner or later." I've heard that voice for 14 years now. So without looking up, I cheerfully replied, "Brenda, good to see you." She was standing next to our table with a guy who was obviously her date. She was as cheerful as ever. I got up from the booth and said by way of introduction, "Stella, this is my ex-wife Brenda." Stella looked up and replied, "It's nice to finally meet you, Brenda. Davy has only good things to say about you." It was brutal. The full force of Stella's beauty made both Brenda and her companion blink. It was like the reaction when stepping out of the shadows into bright sunlight. Brenda said embarrassedly, "This is my fiancé Tom." We shook hands. I knew who Tom Holland was. He was the largest real estate developer in the entire Middle Rio Grande Basin and was rumored to be the Senate candidate for the People's Militia Party. The two of us undoubtedly switched places. I said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Tom, and I wish you two nothing but happiness." This was followed by the typical smiling rejection that people perform when they can't get out of a situation quickly. I sat down, and the two of them headed to their table. Holland cast one last disbelieving glance back. Stella said nonchalantly, "She still regrets losing you, and that man has a very dirty mind." Meeting Brenda was a mere coincidence. We were at Antiquity for a different reason. I looked into Stella's incredible emerald eyes and said, "I told you that we have an initiation ceremony where two people bond with each other." She replied, "Yes, but there is no implant there to guarantee fidelity." I said, "But we do have a sign that a woman wears as a token of her fidelity." I had learned to hide my thoughts somewhat. So when I pulled out the ring, it was a surprise. I said, "We can only promise to be faithful, but I will die before I betray that." An explosion of pure, unrequited love almost knocked me out of the booth. That night was the first time we made love. I was nervous. It was the kind of anxiety one feels when engaging in one last intimate relationship with the most important woman in your life. I asked, "How do you begin to make love in your world?" She replied, "There is no ritual." We connected a month after the divorce. Stella didn't want to use the term married. She said it didn't reflect her feelings for me. The bond was just her and me. That would have been the case even if Stella's relatives didn't live on the other side of the galaxy. That's just the way we were. Stella insisted on the Invidian bond. That's how her homeworld was labeled in my mind. I realized why she wanted to do it that way as we went through the ceremony. We had decided to have it in a special place. So our wedding night was spent in the REI Half-Dome tent. We were sitting on a rock ledge in the Face Shield, a huge cliff behind Albuquerque in the Sandia Mountains. The sun was setting over the purple expanse of desert landscape. The lights of the city began to flicker in the encroaching darkness below us. Stella was enthralled. Perhaps her planet was more advanced. But it had to pay for it with catastrophic overpopulation and environmental destruction. Life there was a joyless endeavor. My world was a land of new experiences, and Stella delighted in every discovery she made. My bride was dressed in rough hiking gear, not a long white dress. We climbed knife-edge rock on a trail that only experienced hikers and climbers can do. Stella handled it better than most of the regulars. One of Stella's quirks was that she could handle any physical challenge without difficulty. I was beginning to realize that, in addition to reading minds, my new wife had powers beyond the world. We dangled our legs over the edge. The July evening was soft and fragrant. Stella told me to lie down on a rock. She laid down beside me, holding my hand. The sky darkened to shades of purple and red, the moon rose, and the first stars began to appear. Stella pointed to the Pleiades cluster and said softly, "Concentrate on that one." I followed her finger to the familiar cluster of stars. As I did so, I felt her tiptoe into my mind. She had set up a tiny mental beacon that transmitted a clear and steady signal of caring love. A powerful subconscious connection had been established between us. When she finished, she said with a blessing, "This will stay between us forever. We are now connected." And thus we were married. It was not in the conventional sense, but it was as deep and real and permanent as any ceremony ever performed in the presence of a priest. Life went on in the same way for nearly a year. It was an endless series of adventures and simple pleasures. I had never been so happy. But of course the gods loved to mess with me. So I came home from work on a beautiful fall day in the desert. The sun was shining and the temperature was over 70. Soccer season was starting, and I was wondering how the Lobos would perform in the Mountain West this season. I walked out of the garage whistling a cheery tune, and there was my wife. She was standing in our kitchen with the most handsome man I'd ever seen. In movies, on TV, on the cover of GQ. He was wearing the same outfit Stella wore when I first saw her. Stella looked glum. She said, "Davy, we need to talk." Those fateful words are usually the prelude to a monumental heartbreak. But I could feel my little beacon giving its clear, confident signal. Nothing had happened to disrupt our connection yet. Even so, my blood pressure spiked to heart attack because of the look on Stella's face. She meekly said, "That's Kalel. He's a grumpy snarl. He's come to take me to Nvidia." The concept of a bounty hunter came to mind. I shouted, "Where to?" I knew exactly what she was talking about, though. It was just a reflex reaction. Kalel was not only handsome like a Greek god, but he was also slender. I wondered if there was a single person on Stella's planet who didn't possess unearthly perfection. He grinned contemptuously and said as if he were talking to a pet, "We've been looking for Stella ever since she jumped through the portal. Now that we've found her, I'm here to bring her back." I said, "This is crazy." "She loves me." "Why would she go with you?" The dude just stared at me like he couldn't believe he was arguing with such an inferior being. Finally, he said, "She has no right to be here. She can alert your authorities to our presence." Then he made a sound of annoyance, turned away and said, "I am not here to discuss this with you, Earthling. Come on, Stella, the portal will be open for a few more minutes." Stella angrily replied, "I told you. I'm not going back. I have my own life here with the man I'm committed to. Nothing you say or do will make me leave him," Mr. Eat said contemptuously. "You cannot be committed to a lower form of life. It is not lawful. Either you come with me or I will take you by force." With that, he grabbed Stella by one of her arms and began dragging her out the door. Apparently, the guy had some kind of UFO parked in our backyard. Stella tried to wrench her arm free. I had to do something about it. There was no way I was going to win a physical fight with this guy. "But that's not how I do things," I said carelessly. "I know you're an alien superintelligence and all that, buddy. But you'll notice that everything you've done since you walked in here has been recorded." I pointed to the tiny surveillance camera in the corner of the ceiling and said, "If you're kidnapping Stella because your Nvidian masters don't want her to reveal the presence of your race, how do you think they'll react when they find you proving that extraterrestrial life does exist via TMZ and Fox News?" I laughed, trying to sound more confident than I actually felt, and added, "We have this thing called the internet. It's out of your league. But I can assure you that you will become a worldwide viral sensation if you don't get in your flying saucer and take a truck back to where you came from." Mr. Eat stopped and looked into the camera. He looked puzzled. Apparently superintelligences aren't that observant. Or maybe he underestimated us Earthlings. I knew exactly what he was thinking. I said informatively, "You're finished. There is nothing here that can be erased. You'll never find the recording. It's being streamed to a cloud account. So smile." The alien dropped Stella's hand and turned to me. He said, "You won't be able to report it if you get vaporized." At that moment, he pulled out what looked like a fountain pen. I didn't seriously think he was going to write me a check. I wasn't scared. I was encouraged. I thought, at least I'll die protecting the woman I love. Then I heard a resounding gong. The light went out in Mr. E.T.'s eyes, and he slumped as if his strings had been cut. Stella stood behind him, stretched out to her full height like Serena Williams hitting a forehand on center court. In both hands, she held an old-fashioned cast-iron skillet. It was a very effective low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. The little beacon in my head flashed brightly. It was Stella, soaring with joy. She said, "I was always afraid someone would come after me. I think we're safe at last." Of course, this presented us with a new problem. We had to get rid of the body. There are a lot of ghost towns around Albuquerque. The closest one was called Golden. In the 19th century, Golden was the center of gold mining in all of Albuquerque, hence the name. There was a Catholic church, saloons, businesses, a school, and even a stock exchange. But the gold ran out at the end of the century, and by the 1920s, Golden had become a ghost town. Their old cemetery is next to a restored church built in 1830. Stella and I drove the 30 miles from our house with Callel strapped in the back like Weekend at Bernie's. The area was completely deserted, just as we expected. I parked and left the headlights on. We dragged the body through the brittle desert shrubbery to a neighborhood of old graves. I knew about the urban legends I'd gathered from burying an alien in a ghost town. The ground was mostly sandy, so it was easy to dig. It's not like they had the dude's fingerprints. He'd be a mysterious unknown. Assuming, of course, they ever find him. We put him in the hole and covered him up. Then we went back to the truck. It was already 10 o'clock when we finished our creepy business. I plopped down in the chair by the fireplace. Stella sat serenely in her usual pose on the couch. I asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" After all, she had just killed a man. She looked at me calmly and replied, "There's nothing to talk about. I could never leave you." So I did what I had to do. I started digging further. Why? Maybe because I'm an insecure wimp. But then again, Stella had just killed someone. I asked, "How do you feel?" "Okay, Snowflake." "Enough," she said simply. "You're the person I'm loyal to, and Callel was going to turn you into a cloud of composite particles. I couldn't let that happen. I promised to be your life's companion, to support you in everything." I did. And in that simple statement was encapsulated all that mattered. Married people care about each other. That is invariable, no matter what planet you come from. This beautiful woman may have come out of a wormhole from another arm of the galaxy, but she understood what love and loyalty was. Time passed and we grew old. Stella was fascinated by aging. She told me that the causes of aging are well understood, and if there is knowledge, it can be managed. On Earth, we call it epigenetics. We've even started doing serious research on telomeres and gene manipulation. But the people on Stella's world perfected the process centuries ago. It was like going to a tanning salon. Every inhabitant went through a life cycle procedure. You lay down in a special device. It would scan you and remove any defects. After that, you could proceed to the next cycle. Since these cycles were similar to Earth's lifespan, citizens on Stella's world lived very long lives, always in perfect physical health. Now we were both feeling the weight of the happy years we had spent together. Stella's transcendent beauty had kept her from being classically destroyed by time. In fact, she was beautiful at any age. I've just gotten older. My commitment to fitness kept me relatively healthy. But there was no escaping the dreaded diagnosis. It was draining my vitality, and Stella was distraught. When the situation became unbearable, my wife loaded me into our truck and we headed south. When she parked near the spot where we first met, a stunning, starry desert sky opened up above us. We then began the harrowing journey through the Jornada del Muerto to the obelisk. 4 miles is a long way for a nearly dead man, and it took several hours. Stella supported me every step of the way with her arm over my shoulder like a warrior wounded by life. The 12-foot-tall monument stood out black against the star-studded sky. The desert was silent. A light wind blew from the west. I was sweating and panting from the effort. Stella let go of my hand and leaned me lovingly against the black lava of the obelisk. She was wearing the suit and armband she had been wearing when I first met her. She walked a few yards past the obelisk and did something with the device. The air began to shimmer, and the stars in that part of the sky disappeared, replaced by a miniature galaxy. She came back to me, threw my arm over her shoulder, and helped me into that spot. She said, "We will make you well again, my love." Epilogue. It was deep night at the Trinity site. It was as dark and lonely all around as only the desert can be. Then a shimmer appeared, growing into a vague shape like a galactic wheel. The shimmer parted like a curtain, and two people walked through it. Then it disappeared. The man was trim and young-looking. The woman was an absolutely gorgeous specimen of femininity. For several long minutes they stood together, gazing wistfully into the night sky. Then they turned and walked hand in hand down the path toward the distant road. She said in the dubious tone of a long-married wife, "Are you sure the truck will start, honey?" He replied in the voice of the archetypally patient husband, "Of course it will start, my love. It's only been a day. Now let's have breakfast. We have a whole life ahead of us." Thanks for watching. What do you think of this type of story? Did you like it? Write in the comments if you want more stories like this. Also, watch the next video and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss new videos.